I just had a long overdue catch up with Brad. I checked in on how Emily's parents were doing since their tragedy. In some welcome news, they're now expecting a new child to join their family. Brad had another story for me though. This was a very personal one that he had been reluctant to tell, but now feels it needs to be shared. This one has kept me awake the past couple of nights, thinking about how my own life has turned out. So I've captured it below to help get it off my mind and pass along with his blessing. In a universe filled with choices, but with only one life in which to make them, regrets become inevitable. Regrets for things done or left undone, for words said or left unsaid. At that moment when death beckons us and our life flashes before our eyes again, how would we feel about the decisions we've made? Would we be proud of the moments that defined us? The things we've done when we think no one else was watching? How we treated those we loved and those close to us? Brad was not the only child in his family. He also had a younger brother, Paul. They could not have been more opposite to each other. Where Brad was brash and wild in his youth, Paul was introverted, contemplative, and like many siblings, their childhood was one of constant warfare with each other. Looking back, Brad freely admits that he was an arrogant, possessive, and obnoxious brat. Any of those traits alone would already have given him an excuse to hate on his little brother. But it was really the fear of the burnt man that started it all. When Brad was the only child, he reveled in the attention and adoration that brought him. That's all changed when his brother Paul was born 3 years later. At first, Brad had loved the idea of a brother to play with. He imagined they would play together, be best friends. That idea disappeared when he discovered Paul was a useless baby that only cried, smelled bad, and demanded constant attention. The second year was not much better, with Paul starting to get a larger share of Brad's toys and presents. It became really bad in the third year, when Brad had to give up half his room and share it with Paul. He found they had nothing in common. Where Brad liked being loud and attention-seeking with others, Paul just babbled, talked with himself. Brad loved being outside and active. Paul preferred to stay indoors, drawing with his crayon set. What really unsettled Brad, though, was what Paul would draw. There would be the typical things every child draws: houses, animals, trees, and family. What was unusual was every drawing of their family always had an extra person. Their parents would be there, and Brad and Paul, all drawn in rainbow hues. Right next to Paul, though, would be a mysterious figure drawn in black and red. The family's faces would all have big smiles, but this stranger was a disfigured mess. 2 big black circles for eyes and a shapeless mass for the mouth. In every drawing of the stranger, he was missing an arm. He had red streaks running through all over. Over time, this stranger began to feature more and more prominently in the drawings. Brad and his parents would no longer appear in them, just Paul playing with that stranger inside the house or outside in the yard. At first, their parents were extremely concerned and they asked Paul, "Who is that man?" He told them quite nonchalantly it was his friend, the burned man. He had always been there for as long as Paul could remember. He never said anything. He just stood there, watching, listening. His parents took Paul to see a few child counselors, as much for their own peace of mind as Paul's. But they all concluded it was just an imaginary friend. It was a normal phase that every child would go through at that age. Granted, it was a bit more unsettling than having a unicorn or an elf for a friend, but Paul was psychologically well adjusted, and the figure didn't seem related to any real-life predator or trauma. One night, when Brad was 8 and Paul was 5, they stayed awake after their parents had tucked them in. Brad could not sleep, and he wanted to know more about the burned man. Paul explained that he had been in an accident, a fire that had burned his entire body and face. It had melted his eyes away and made his arm go missing. He was very sad. Paul didn't find the burned man scary though. He had always been around. He just never did anything. Just watched and listened. Brad told him he was stupid for having an imaginary friend. Paul yawned and simply replied that he was not imaginary, that he was in the room with them right now. In fact, he was standing right next to Brad, watching and listening, as he did every night. Brad felt a chill go up his spine. He had always been a brave child, but for this time, he felt fear as he had never felt it in his life. He looked all around in the darkness, not sure if the shadows were his imagination or the burned man waiting for him to go to sleep. Brad didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, convinced that he needed a room of his own. He could no longer share a room with his annoying brother and his creepy friend. But he couldn't admit that he was afraid either. So his 8-year-old mind came up with an idea. His plan was simple. He would make it so painful for their parents to keep them together that they would be forced to keep them in separate rooms. And so began their adversarial relationship. They fought over everything for many years, and often physically. Brad would go out of his way to antagonize Paul, or to get him into trouble. Each prank they played on each other escalated into new rounds of retaliation, all to the exacerbation of their long-suffering parents. It would take 6 more years until they moved to a bigger house and they were finally able to have separate rooms. And finally, the feuds began to die down. The burned man had been all but forgotten by then, replaced with pure animosity towards each other. Late one night, in their new home, Brad recalled returning to his bed after a bathroom visit, only to find a figure standing next to him, watching him. A charred, bleeding face stared at him through hollow eye sockets, and it moaned silently at him through an open jaw. It reached for him with a horribly burned hand, the other one hanging uselessly by its side with the lower half missing. Brad screamed so loud that it woke the house, and the figure immediately disappeared by the time he blinked. When Paul came into the room to check what all the commotion was about, Brad told him that he saw the burned man. Paul laughed heartily and said that he hadn't seen him in years. In fact, he could barely even remember him. In any case, he couldn't see him in the room now. Paul closed the door as he left, then reopened it quickly, shouting, "Boo," before laughing again and walking back to his room and letting their groggy and sleep-deprived parents standing in the hallway know that Brad was just being a wuss. For Brad, the memory of it seemed very real though. What lingered in the air was not just the terror, but an overwhelming sense of sadness he felt from the encounter. Another incident was when Paul was 17 and the victim of a hit-and-run accident. He was rushed to hospital in a critical condition, and the doctors were not sure if he would survive. Paul was lying in bed in a coma, with his parents crying around him. When Brad arrived, he could see a disfigured Grim Reaper looming over the bed, as if holding vigil, waiting for its prey. It was the burned man, watching Paul intently, all while the family wept, oblivious to its presence. "Just go already. Why are you still here? You're useless. Just leave us," Brad remembered shouting at the figure as it faded away. It only resulted in a sudden and severe reprimanding from his parents, thinking that those words were for his brother. "Paul is dying, Brad. It's time to put your stupid feud behind. We're a family, for God's sake. Act like it." The words stung Brad, especially since he couldn't explain that he wasn't shouting at Paul. He quickly fumed and then stormed out. Paul did recover 2 days later though, and he was out of the hospital a week later. That last incident was 15 years ago. The burned man was never seen again by either of them. Brad had become a serious and buttoned-down computer analyst since then. Paul married, had 2 children of his own, and had saved countless lives through his job as an EMT. They had eventually developed a grudging respect for one another, though their lives had drifted off in different directions over the years. The burned man was just another long-forgotten childhood memory, filed away, never thought of again. Until recently, when a tragedy brought it all back into sharp focus. A few weeks ago, Brad learned that his brother had died while on duty. He was on scene with other emergency services, dealing with a factory fire. A chemical storage tank had abruptly exploded next to his location, dousing him in burning chemicals. The flying shrapnel had sheared off his left arm above the elbow. Paul was 32. In a life filled with many regrets, Brad has added one more to his list. He never did let Paul know that he was proud of him, and that despite their differences, he did always love him as a brother. He regrets that his last words to Paul were not goodbye or sentiments of love or support, but a text message which read, "You suck. I've shat better excuses than that." It was said in jest about why Paul didn't have time to catch up over a weekend. But it was devastating, knowing it would be the last memory both had of each other. So every now and then, Brad has been talking to the silence in the room, hoping that his brother, the burned man, is still around to hear. Now much older and wiser though, his fear is no longer of the burned man, but that there's no one listening, except himself. Another self, one that has been with him since childhood, watching in silence while it reviews his life, powerless to stop whatever fate awaits him, judging him with regret for the decisions he's made and is yet to make.